Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. I'm very excited to have Joyce Vance with us today. We'll chat with Joyce in just a moment, but first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So Joyce Vance is the former U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama, an office she held during the Obama administration. She resigned on the eve of Donald Trump's first inauguration at the end of 25 years of service as a career federal prosecutor. She's a distinguished professor of the practice of law at the University of Alabama School of Law. She's also a legal analyst for NBC and MSNBC. She's the author of the popular Civil Discourse Substack, and the co-host of two podcasts, #Sisters-in-Law and Cafe's Insider. Her latest book is Giving Up Is Unforgivable, a manual for keeping a democracy. Joyce, welcome into the back room.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's an honor to have you here. I want to start with some news that broke this morning. I want to talk about the Epstein situation. Today, as I think you have to be living under a rock not to know that it's the 30 days of the 30-day deadline. The Department of Justice has been compelled to release the full Epstein files, according to the law that was passed a month ago. This morning, Deputy Attorney...
laws. Seriously? Are we going to take laws seriously at this point?
I know, right? It's kind of crazy. Law schmaws.
Little quaint.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like he's the president or anything, right? So Deputy AG Todd Blanche went on Fox this morning and said, we're going to release hundreds of thousands of documents, but we're also not going to release hundreds of thousands of documents. We may release them later. I'm not a lawyer, but I think the law said you have to release everything today, not start today. And so what do you make of what he said, and what do you think is going to happen now?
Yeah, so the law was a deadline, right? I mean, this was not the earliest day they could have released them. It was the very last day that they could have released them. And it's an exceptional moment that this law had to be passed at all. I mean, I'm sure everybody recalls the history, right? We lived through a government shutdown because Congress, the House, did not want to vote for this. And we lived through a 50-day delay in the swearing in of a newly elected representative from Arizona in a special election because she was the final vote needed to put the discharge petition across the finish line. So even in Congress, there was a real fight against doing this. Donald Trump was forced to sign that law, by the way, because of the weight of public opinion demanding answers about what went on in the Epstein case. You know, it would be bad enough if this was a case of sex trafficking that somehow just slipped through the tracks and didn't get prosecuted. But that wasn't the case. This didn't fall through the cracks. This was a case where unconscionable plea deals were given to Jeffrey Epstein in Florida years ago that purported to cut off the rights of his victims and protect all of his co-conspirators. And so we don't come to this situation as a blank slate. That's why, you know, in every criminal case DOJ prosecutes, there's not a law that says DOJ has to release the file once the case is concluded. This case is unusual because of its history. And so DOJ is obligated to follow the law. Congress has spoken. DOJ's job is to follow the law, not to write the law, something that I was schooled in as a prosecutor. It didn't matter if you disagreed with the law. Your job was to enforce the law. DOJ does have a little bit of a leg to stand on here, but it's a pretty rotten one. You know, the leg that they can stand on is, well, we have this brand new investigation that we've opened, and so we won't reveal any documents that are related to that. And that's a flawed argument for two reasons. One is it's just a BS investigation. This was a case that Donald Trump directed the Attorney General to open, something that just does not and should not happen. And he directed her to investigate only Democrats who were implicated in any of the Epstein files. So that's just, it's, you know, pretty pretextual. Even beyond that, though, if your excuse for not turning over documents is that you have an ongoing investigation, well, fine. The president has laid down the limits. Hold on to every document that's about a Democrat, but you got to turn over documents about all of the Republicans and Donald Trump, who's not under investigation. So this is a really thin excuse. I think the problem is Congress isn't going to do anything about it. Pam Bondi isn't going to do anything about it. It'll be up to the people if there's sufficient outrage to demand more fulsome answers.
Yeah, we're in this weird place for the first time in our history where the entity of government that is responsible for upholding the law, the Department of Justice, is itself the biggest perpetrator of violating or skirting the law these days. So it's kind of scary when you think about, well, who's going to police the police, you know?
This is a unique Justice Department. I mean, not to say that the institution is perfect, but the institution is admirable. You know, it's the only cabinet level agency whose name is a moral virtue. And everyone who works there is always aware of that and tries to live up to that. We've had a remarkable string of attorneys general with very few exceptions, and people who have accepted accountability when they have not lived up to the job. And of course, that's all off the table now. This is a Justice Department that is in the president's hip pocket. It's a political tool for him to deploy. Revenge on his enemies, benefits for his friends. Any pretense of being the people's lawyers is off the table.
Yeah, well, let's stick with the DOJ for a minute. You are a former federal prosecutor.
25 years.
And his retribution campaign that you just spoke of, it seems to have hit some roadblocks, in particular the Lindsay Halligan fiasco and the attempts to prosecute Tish James and James Comey. Are they just the gang that can't shoot straight? How concerned ultimately are you about the quote-unquote revenge campaign in real terms?
Well, thank God that there's a certain amount of incompetence going on, right? And I mean, the reality is, with this sort of an agenda in mind, it limits the people that you can hire and put in place, right? There are a lot of really great qualified Republicans, many of my former colleagues, who would be superlative attorneys general, but they weren't going to sign on for this sort of a gig, nor were they going to sign on to be directors of the FBI, because they're not interested in pursuing the president's revenge agenda. They're interested in pursuing justice. That's our mission at DOJ. Look, I was a Republican hire at DOJ. The U.S. attorney who brought me on board was a Republican, and I was an appointee in a Democratic presidential administration where we prided ourselves on acting in a bipartisan fashion. For the first couple of years after the transition in the Obama administration, the Council of U.S. Attorneys who advised the Attorney General of the United States was made up of Democratic and Republican appointees as U.S. attorneys. My Republican colleagues in New Orleans and Montgomery, Alabama, and Baltimore and Chicago served alongside us, and we reached unanimous decisions. That's how DOJ is supposed to work. We're in a perilous moment. It will be very important to not just restore the Justice Department, but to transform it, to develop a tough protective shell that will make sure that political influence can't be brought to bear again once all of this is over.
Yeah, I heard somebody yesterday, I can't remember his name, but he has a very strong legal background, and he said it'll probably take a decade to rebuild the Department of Justice.
I don't know. I think we can get there more quickly. I mean, I think, look, not to make light of it, but I will say this. I'm an institutionalist. You know, I wrote a book where I copped to being an institutionalist. I think that the institution is nimble. I think what the institution wasn't prepared for was a bunch of bad actors simultaneously going into place. People who, you know, to borrow from our friends in the military, people who were willing to obey illegal orders, because that's exactly what's going on. And that's the fix we find ourselves in. New people, better people, career prosecutors across the country, regardless of their political perspective, are outraged. They're just trying to keep their heads down and do their jobs and protect citizens in their districts from violent crime and other criminal conduct as best as they can in this moment. The career folks will be delighted to participate in restoration of the department.
Is there a distinction between rebuilding from a personnel standpoint versus rebuilding or building the cases that would have been done during that 4-year period so that the amount of crime that is taken down is going to take that much longer to do so?
So look, you're not going to be able to go back and redo cases that didn't get done simply because there will be statute of limitations problems on many of them. But the reality is 99% of the Justice Department's work is going on unimpeded. Federal prosecutors are indicting bank robbers and violent criminals. There's been a tampdown, quite frankly, on their ability to go after public corruption, certain kinds of white-collar crime. But it's a big country. There are 94 U.S. attorneys' offices across the country. 93 U.S. attorneys. Guam and the Mariana Islands share a U.S. attorney. And a lot of those offices are very remote from Washington. And so although those U.S. attorneys, some of them are acting, some of them are now confirmed Trump U.S. attorneys, but many of them are just interested in keeping their district safe and in doing their jobs. We saw the U.S. attorney in Boston last night do a press conference where she talked about the old-fashioned gumshoe, police work that led to identification and arrest of the shooter who they tell us was responsible for both the Brown University mass shooting, but also the death of an MIT professor. That sort of work is going on. What's not happening? The prosecution of Tom Homan, Trump's border czar, who apparently took bribes. We don't know if that case would have resulted in prosecution.
Tom Bag of Cash Homan.
Yeah. The investigation just gets prematurely terminated. And of course, we have time wasted on these ridiculous revenge prosecutions that aren't going anywhere. If you cannot get a grand jury to indict your case, that's a really good sign to just walk away. You don't have it.
Yeah. This Susie Wiles piece in Vanity Fair, which I think and many people think is a bombshell, related to the retribution campaign. She spoke about that. And I'm curious to know from your expert opinion, was that a gift to the defense teams of Tish James, James Comey, Adam Schiff, and anyone else he's been targeting?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? There's a powerful argument that these cases have to be dismissed because they're vindictive prosecutions, that these people are being prosecuted for exercising First Amendment rights, other constitutional rights, and also that they're selective prosecutions, that they're being prosecuted for crimes no one else would be, that they're being targeted for political purposes. I would say maybe she puts the exclamation point at the end of the sentence because those motions are already strong. It doesn't look like they're going to be able to get a grand jury to re-indict Tish James. The Jim Comey case, there's just not a crime there. And even if there was, a federal judge has now ruled that the government was improperly accessing evidence that was critical to the case to the extent that there was one. So it's tough to see how they'll go forward. Does not look like the U.S. attorney in Maryland is super interested in indicting Adam Schiff, probably because there's no evidence that Adam Schiff violated the law. This is the reality that you face as a prosecutor. Yes, grand juries will indict a ham sandwich. Yes, I've spent a lot of time in front of grand juries working with them on indictments. If there is not a crime there, grand jurors are smart and they will suss that. I've never been in that situation. I've never tried to indict something that wasn't a crime. But grand jurors ask insightful questions. And I've often, listened to their commentary and said, do you need to hear from another witness before you vote? And they'll ask for clarification. You'll bring in the appropriate witness. Prosecutors, what they say in the grand jury is not evidence. It's not testimony. You bring in witnesses, but you serve as their legal advisor. So you can explain what the charges are, what the elements of those charges are, burdens of proof. And in that way, you have a lot of interaction with the grand jury. But grand jurors are there to do their jobs. They're not there to do prosecutors' bidding at the end of the day.
Well, I'm delighted to hear your optimism about the institution, the DOJ, and a lot of what you're saying. And so to circle back to what I was saying about the gang that can't shoot straight, so far at least, does it appear to you that this is more of a harassment campaign, make somebody's life miserable campaign versus a legal one?
If Donald Trump has a modus operandi, it's the comments that he's made in multiple situations. Just announce the investigation and I can take it from there, right? That's what he asked Vladimir Zelensky for in Ukraine, leading to the first impeachment. That's what he asked acting officials at the Justice Department to do ahead of January 6th. Just announce a fraud investigation. I can take it from there. And I think that we're seeing that here, too. He doesn't care if these folks get convicted. He just wants to force them through the public embarrassment, the pain, the family stress, the cost of a prosecution.
So let me ask you about what's happening off the coast of Venezuela. Trump just blew up 2 more alleged narco-terrorist boats, a total of 26 so far, over 100 people dead, not confirmed that they're actually drug traffickers. Is the United States committing murder in the Caribbean and the Pacific?
That's certainly a potential interpretation of what's going on here. Look, I think part of the problem that we have is that there's not sufficient clarity, which makes it irresponsible for Roger Wicker, the Mississippi senator who heads the Senate subcommittee, the Armed Forces subcommittee, to shut down this investigation prematurely. It is, by the way, Congress's ability to declare war, their power to declare war, not the president's power to declare war. So they're flirting yet again with giving up some of their constitutional power. Of course, presidents do have extraordinary abilities in emergency situations. And this, again, is a theme of the Trump presidency. We've seen him seize on these areas where presidents are afforded emergency powers in extreme situations. And then he manufactures the situation and claims it's an emergency. We've seen that with the National Guard deployment, right? Oh, it's terrible. Violent crime is eating up Portland, where people are out line dancing in the streets. And then he says, and no court can review my decision. Once I say it's an emergency, it's an emergency. I claim these extraordinary powers. I do as I want. No one can stop me. We're seeing some of that again here in this setting. You know, we know that the commander at Southern Command stepped down prematurely. No one knows for certain what that's about, but under the circumstances, it's difficult not to speculate that that could have been about refusing to accept an illegal order. Mm-hmm. If these people are combatants, then laws of war apply. And of course, we've seen a lot of talk about the so-called second tap, the second strike on the first boat that was attacked, where people who were clearly shipwrecked, trying to hold on to the wreckage of their boat for their lives, were then killed. And the justification that we heard from Tom Cotton and others was, well, they were on an identified list. You know, even if we're at war, that's very nebulous. If we're not at war, then as you say, it's just murder. That's a long-winded explanation. And it's long-winded because I want to make sure people understand these aren't easy issues. Mm-hmm. These are nuanced issues. Experts debate these issues. People who are versed in these sorts of situations debate them. But something that I know as a former prosecutor is that our country has great expertise at interdicting drug shipments into this country that come in by way of the waters. And what we do is the Coast Guard interdicts those shipments, seizes the drugs, the people involved are brought to the United States to face prosecution. That's how we do it. Those people are entitled to due process under our system. We don't just blow people out of the water and kill them. And certainly not in cases where, you know, the original justification for this, right, was fentanyl, narco-terrorism. No fentanyl seized on these ships. Cocaine is a subject for law enforcement and interdiction.
Well, the fentanyl doesn't come from Venezuela. It comes from Mexico by way of China. And so that, but you know, the whole narco-terrorist thing. Well,
and there's one other problem, right? Some of these early boats are loaded with people. And if you're transporting drugs, you don't waste space. You don't waste freight on human beings. And so there's, I think, a strong suggestion that there was an element of human trafficking here, and it's possible that we killed victims as well. Yet again, a reason Congress should be fully engaged in an investigation.
Yeah, and the other inherent problem is if you're really concerned about drug trafficking, you don't pardon Juan Hernandez, a convicted drug trafficker.
Yes, exactly.
And the interesting thing to me is, and this is the same thing with the Epstein files, because we're seeing how defensive, no pun intended, I guess, Pete Hegseth is at the Defense Department, that this was a legit strike.
I'm sorry, isn't it the War Department now?
Not to me, it is. It's not the War Department.
Really hate
it's not the Gulf of America, and it's not the Trump Kennedy Center. Never was.
I really like you. Yes.
So, you know, when they ask Hegseth, are you going to release the video? Let the public see. They're not going to do that. We can't do that. It's top secret. But you can release 26 videos of boats getting blown up. But the one video that has two helpless guys holding on for dear life getting blown up, like that you can't release. But it's like with the Epstein file, if you're innocent, you got nothing to hide. You promised you'd release all this stuff. Why aren't you releasing it? With the double tap video, if you have nothing to hide, if Americans are going to watch it and go, hey, these guys deserve to die, then release it. But they never release the things that they always say will have exculpatory photos, images, documents, whatever. And that, to me, is the proof in the pudding.
You know, Donald Trump has successfully used a delay strategy so many times over and over again, right? If you can just put it off till tomorrow and live to fight another day, ultimately people will forget about it or the courts will run out of time or whatever it is. I think we're seeing that as a strategy in this administration. Put off the bad stuff for as long as possible. Say whatever you need to say. Most people won't even realize you're contradicting yourself if they're even paying attention at all. And really, one of the interesting developments, in 2025 was a sizable number of Americans seemed to become more alert to what was going on. 7 to 8 million people out protesting on No King's Day. Increasingly, people paying attention. This off-year election that had crazy results that you don't see in off-year elections. So I think, not to be Pollyanna, because I'm not. I think we have a prolonged marathon ahead of us. I'm encouraged by the fact that more of our fellow citizens are taking this seriously.
Yeah. And to your point, I think with Epstein and the double tap situation, when it comes to the sex trafficking of minors and murder, I think those things can break through and have broken through in a way that his other horrifying statements have not. But that sort of dovetails into the thing I want to ask you before I want to ask you about your book is this whole Rob Reiner thing. Because we had a weekend where 15 people died in a horrific anti-Semitic act of violence in Australia. We had the 2 people die up at Brown University, and Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle getting murdered. This is all, I think, in maybe even a less than 24-hour period. And what does the leader of the free world do? He posts this vile, disgusting diatribe about Rob Reiner. And that seems to have broken through in a way also that all his other horrifying statements and actions have not. So it sort of feels like, as Marjorie Taylor Greene said this week, the dam is breaking. It feels like it, no?
I always thought naively, as it turns out, that the fever dream would sort of break, right? I thought during Donald Trump's first term in office that Americans would be so disgusted in the first instance by family separation that they would reject whatever snake oil they had been buying from Donald Trump. And of course, that didn't happen. And I think what you're saying is correct. It's not going to be this wake up, snap moment. It's a longer trajectory that starts, I think, with Epstein, really, for many people, was a moment, and then it continues so that now people are more inclined to pay attention because, the comments, the horrific comments that the president made about Rob Reiner and his wife, that's not the first time he said something awful and shameless and unbefitting of the office. But it is the first time that Americans seem to have paid attention in a sustained way. And perhaps what that points to is that Americans are now more inclined to scrutinize Donald Trump's behavior. I hope so. We should be doing it. It's just horrible, the sort of example he sets for America's children and the sort of behavior that's being enabled across the board.
Yeah, and you're right, because he has said so many horrible things before. But I think it was just this 3 strikes thing. It's like people were watching the TV and seeing the Brown shooting, seeing seeing these horrific acts of violence. And then, oh my God, Rob Reiner, who, I don't care who you are. You loved All in the Family. You love his movies. And then Trump comes in for the kill. And it's like, my God, don't you have an ounce of humanity, compassion, empathy? It struck a chord in a way because of the compounding effect of it.
Rob Reiner hated who Donald Trump was as the president, and he wasn't shy about saying that. And the way you handle that as a president, at a minimum, just don't say anything, right? Didn't our mamas teach us if you don't have anything nice to say, keep your mouth shut?
Right.
But really what you do as a president in that situation is you're gracious and you just say, Rob Reiner and I didn't like each other. His death is tragic. My sympathies go to his family, and you leave it at that. Maybe you even acknowledge the genius of his work, right? People used to sort of just take for granted that Joe Biden was the great consoler. I miss that.
Yeah.
I miss the Barack Obama who sang at a funeral after that horrible, tragic shooting at Mother Emanuel in South Carolina. I miss presidents who led and who brought the country together. George Bush, obviously, I was not a fan of his politics. In the moments after 9/11, I was grateful for his leadership. We've never seen that sort of leadership from Donald Trump. He's just not capable of it.
Well, we've never had an actual sociopath in the White House, and that's the problem. And I think
that's a fair point.
People, all you got to do is watch one night of news and watch the panels, and everybody's like, why would he say that today? I think in this country, we have to just accept the chilling reality that there is a sociopath in the White House. And that explains everything he's done, everything he said, and everything he's going to do and try to do for the next 3 years. And instead of asking questions, focus our energies on how do we stop him? How do we use the courts? How do we use Congress? How do we use resistance? How do we stop a sociopath from doing really bad things? That's, to me, going to be most effective.
It's what could the Germans have done to cut off Hitler? I hate using the Hitler analogy because obviously there are reasons it's overblown, but take your pick of, dictatorial leaders. What could people have done? What does history tell us they could have done early on to stand up? And a big part of it, quite frankly, is just refusing to give in to the bully. Trump, like so many would-be dictators, is pushing this narrative that he's invincible, he's inevitable, there's nothing that we can do to counter him. And that's just not true.
Yeah, well, look, as a Jew, I take no offense with the Hitler analogy because I use it myself, because the reality is Hitler...
We used to always tell our kids they lost any argument where they raised Hitler as a comparison, and increasingly we live in a world where it's a legitimate comparison.
Yeah, because the reality is Hitler wasn't always Hitler. Hitler was Trump, right? If you go to, 1929 or the early 30s, Hitler was more Trumpian than he was Hitler-esque. He became the Hitler we know because of what you said, because nobody stopped him, because Chamberlain appeased him, because the world let him do what he eventually did, and it was horrifying. And that's why it's so important to make those comparisons, because sadly, history does repeat itself if you don't do anything to change it. Let's talk about your book. Congrats on the success of it. It's called Giving Up Is Unforgivable, a manual for keeping a democracy. Tell us about the book and why you felt compelled to write it at this point in time.
Yeah, so, I was completely surprised that so many people were willing to read a book about democracy and seemed to actually like it and want to discuss it. That, too, is part of my growing mood of optimism, because I started writing it in that period right after Kamala Harris had lost the election. And I'll tell you what scared me. So many people that I knew well, that I had worked with in politics, both locally here in Alabama, but also nationally, people were discouraged and they were ready to give up. And I had this same conversation with a lot of women who said, I did everything that I could do. We had a great candidate. We fought like crazy and we lost. I'm done. I'm out. I give up. I'm burnt out. There's nothing that I can do. I was terrified that Donald Trump was about to take office with absolutely no guardrails, because we knew that in Trump 2.0, he was going to surround himself with sycophants. We knew that he had the agenda outlined in Project 2025 ready to implement. And really, the way our system of government is set up, it's the people are really that last guardrail, right? The American people have so much power. And we were willing to surrender that in the moment. We had perhaps forgotten how powerful we were. We'd taken democracy for granted for so long, accepted this notion that the gridlock Congress couldn't get anything done. And I just wanted to write to people sort of a love letter to democracy and explain what the founding fathers had created and how we could use it to regain control of our democracy.
Yeah, and the title is a declaration, not a suggestion. And so given what we're experiencing right now with Trump 2.0, quote unquote, giving up truly is unforgivable, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, giving up lets Trump win, right?
Mm-hmm.
It might be a hard path to being the guardrail. It might be difficult. We might not be fully successful. But if we just give up, does anyone really think that that's a good outcome for the country? That would just be insanity.
Mm-hmm. You argue that democracy isn't self-executing. What do you think too many Americans misunderstand about how fragile our institutions actually are?
Yeah. I think in many cases, we believe that democracy is the work of other people, right? Let the politicians do it. Let the lawyers do it. And in reality, the vision of the founding fathers was that democracy belonged to the people, that we elected representatives who worked for us. Of course, we live now in a world where in many elections, because of gerrymandering, politicians are permitted to pick their voters, as opposed to letting voters pick their elected officials. And so it's a moment where we have to fundamentally seize control of the process. Here's an example. In Michigan, they now have a bipartisan commission that draws their electoral maps. I've got friends in Michigan who just rave about this process. It's not easy, it's not perfect, but they're taking the politics out of the maps, which is utterly essential. I tell the story in the book about a long-running bet between Angus King, now a senator from Maine when he was the governor, and Jesse Ventura, who many people know from the world of wrestling, when he was the governor in Minnesota. And they had a bet about which state could have higher voter turnout. And of course, if you're an elected official, maybe you're not benefited if everybody who's eligible is encouraged and able to vote. But those two understood something important, that voting was a fundamental right, that their job as elected officials was to make it accessible and encourage everybody to vote. And who those people voted for was a political act, and it was up to them to fight for their citizens, their constituents' votes with their ideas, during the campaign process, but that it was their job to make sure everybody could vote. Those two states were at the top of the list for voter turnout during that period. Mm-hmm. They're still near the top of the list, even years later. We need that pro-voting culture in this country. That's essential.
Yeah, I say this all the time. Election day is the one day of the year where the janitor and the billionaire have the exact same power. And it's tragic. So true. Tragic that people don't understand. Some people don't understand that. When Trump won last November, and then once he was inaugurated, the huge concern among a lot of people was that, oh my God, democracy's dead, right? We're finished. And then things started to play out over the year, and some people changed their perceptions. You've prosecuted corruption, organized crime. How do you assess the threat today posed by Trump and his administration as they openly violate the law and try to, attack democracy on all kinds of levels, attack the institutions? Do you see him going into 26 less of an existential threat to democracy?
I don't. I think the threat is extremely serious. I think that we have to keep eyes on it. We have to be prepared to, run a marathon for this election. There's absolutely no doubt that Donald Trump and his followers will do what they can to suppress people who are entitled to vote from exercising their rights to vote in 2026. The job we all have in front of us is to make sure that everybody can register, stay registered, vote, and have their vote counted. That is going to be a fight this year to hold a free and fair election. But the reality is, because we don't have one national election, we've got 50 state elections that are administered in most cases at the county level. We have incredible control over our elections, and everyone who's interested and willing, there's a job for you, whether it's volunteering to work at the polls, being a poll watcher, helping people register. An increasing issue for this election will be making sure people have the ID that they need to have to vote, because Trump is trying to impose these very restrictive laws that will, for instance, make passports the easiest way to vote. And that's Alabama girl here. I know a poll tax when I see one, right? Requiring people to have a prohibitively expensive document that most people don't keep on hand. We would call that a poll tax down here. We shouldn't have to deal with that stuff, but we're going to have to. And so we should just be realistic and get ready to work. The argument that I make in the book, Andy, is that because we have three branches of government and checks and balances, a president shouldn't be able to engage in these kind of excesses. the reality that we live with is that Congress has been pretty much asleep at the switch since January. At least the Republicans have been. And the courts are fascinating, right? Federal district judges are the guardians, the champions, the heroes of democracy. The Supreme Court, not so much. Something it'll be essential to do once people who are pro-democracy regain control of this country is to put an ethics code in place for the Supreme Court and enforce it, and perhaps to talk about term limits or increasing the court from, right now it's at 9. We have 11 geographic circuits across the country. It would make a lot of sense to increase to 11 for administrative reasons. We would obviously need to find a way to do that so that it's not just a political race to the bottom. But there are structural reforms that we need to engage in. That can only happen, though, if people who believe in democracy win this next election.
Mm-hmm. We touched a little bit before on optimism. We touched on Trump's flood the zone exhaustive strategy. The book balances urgency with hope. Where do you personally, and how do you personally find optimism when the legal and political landscape feels as overwhelming as it does lately?
So my optimism is grounded in hard work, right? I think if you're working hard and doing what you can and you're part of a community that's working hard, you're entitled to be optimistic. It's grounded in your understanding of what's possible. But look, the reality here is it is going to be a fight. The institutions that we have, the rule of law, give us the ability to win that fight if we accept the challenge. And so the book came out before this off-year election. And so the first couple of weeks that I was out talking with people about the book across the country, my sense was that people really wanted to hope, they really wanted to believe, but it was a struggle because of much of what we had seen. And then we had this off-year election where Democrats won races that they weren't expected to win. And I was in Houston right after that election, and people came up to me from multiple counties around Houston, and they said, we had great success in removing people, MAGA people, from school boards and replacing them with candidates who believe in democracy. And they were so proud of what they had accomplished. They hadn't been sure that they could pull it off. They understood it was a tremendous achievement. And I noticed that after that election, people began to believe that we could accomplish what Donald Trump tells us is impossible. And of course, that's that first argument that I make in the book, that the would-be dictator wants you to believe that there's nothing that you can do. And if you succumb to his narrative, then you're doomed. What you have to do is refuse to believe his narrative, understand the strengths that are built into our system, take advantage of them.
So in that spirit, what's the biggest takeaway you hope readers have when they finish this book?
At the risk of sounding like a Nike commercial, it's just do something, right? It's don't sit at home and be depressed and think that we're doomed. The lesson that I learned from working with folks in the civil rights movement, and I mean the foot soldiers, the people who protested, who walked across the bridges, it's to always fight a fight like this in community. You don't have to beat Donald Trump and fascism all on your own. Find a group of people and work with that group on whatever you're interested in. If it's public health, work on public health. If you want to write music to inspire people, do that. If you want to work on elections, do that. But find your people online or in person, and let's all get to work. Because if we're all doing whatever piece is in front of us, I have confidence that there are enough of us that we can pull this off.
Such really important suggestions. Joyce, thanks so much for coming on and chatting with me, and I hope you'll come back and do it again sometime soon.
I'd love to. Thanks for having me.
All righty. Take care.
You too.
This episode was produced and edited by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and Jen Hammoud for Radio Free Rhinecliff, with additional editing by Maddie Rosenberg, music by Andrew Hollander, and graphic design by Cricket Langale. And with a special thanks to our sponsor, The Epicurean. Again, thanks for listening. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to the Backroom with Andy Ostroy YouTube channel, where you can watch full videos of our interviews. See you next time.